Welcome to the Birth Lounge Podcast, an empowering space for expecting and new parents to hear candid conversations with experts, support your mental health, and learn the tips and tricks that thousands of parents have used to craft their ideal birth. We will answer all of your questions, the scary ones and the weird ones, to help calm your fears and feel confident going into your birth. I'm going to help you redefine what birth and motherhood looks like and how to embrace your journey. I've intentionally crafted a list of experts to help you navigate pregnancy, explore your birth options, and plan for postpartum so that it can be a time of soaking in your tiny human. We're going to go there on all the hard topics so that you can dive deep into finding your confidence and freeing yourself from fears around birth. With over 10 years of experience in family education and a master's degree in human development and family studies, I created this podcast as a way to share the resources parents need to make educated and informed decisions about their care in pregnancy and childbirth. This is a birth community driven by evidence-based information and research in hopes to help you explore your options, understand your rights, and know what choices you have along the way when it comes to birth and beyond. I'm your host, HeHe. Now let's get to the good stuff. Dr. Lorraine, Dr. Brie, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Hi there, thank you.
I'm so excited to have you guys. It's not often that we get a duo on the show, and I always just feel a little bit of extra added pressure of, oh, there's some really big brains in this room, and I hope I ask the right questions, and I want to dig into all the knowledge that you guys have, and this is a topic that is getting a lot of light. Women are starting to wake up, but we really need to understand what we're talking about when it comes to obstetrical violence so that we truly can be the ones that are making the decisions about our bodies and our birth and our reproductive journey. Starting very basic, Lorraine, can you start us out with what is obstetrical violence? What does it look like? What are some examples? And I think it would also be helpful to hear some places where maybe we commonly encounter obstetrical violence, but it doesn't necessarily register with us.
Sure, we can cover all of that. I'll start off with an overview for the question of what is obstetric violence. Obstetric violence involves the mistreatment, disrespect, and abuse of birthing people, and the issue has been recognized as a public health problem and a human rights issue worldwide in every region of the world. Obstetric violence is a gendered, sex-specific form of violence against women, and it is a violation of human rights and public health. That's why we have agencies up to the level of the World Health Organization and the United Nations who are also making global statements and working on this problem at that level. The harms we know that are associated with obstetric violence include psychological trauma, avoidable morbidity and mortality, unnecessary invasive procedures and cesarean surgeries, disrespect and incivility, impaired newborn bonding, including disrupted breastfeeding, and future avoidance of the healthcare system. And I made a really happy connection when I was circling back to when you and I met and looking more at your podcast. And I was really excited and interested to see that you had attorney Hayes Klein on in your recent episode 283. And she is one of the few and probably one of the most recognizable birth rights and specifically obstetric violence, maternal newborn injury, and reproductive rights attorney in the US. And you guys talked a lot about the pathway when people are looking for recourse and redress for accountability when they have been victims of or suffered harm from obstetric violence. You guys talked a lot about the parts that tend to be more recognizable in the United States, which is the lack of informed consent, coercion, and forced procedures. And there's a lot of involvement of things that can be shady, outright lying by providers, fraud, deceptive practices, bait and switch. Something that is being discussed much more now in bioethics broadly is the violation of the fiduciary responsibility of the healthcare provider to the birthing person and what their duties of loyalty are and primary trust and loyalty in that relationship, where the healthcare provider absolutely has more power than the birthing person. And I would like to say that I recently received your scripts for advocacy. So you have framed that in a really proactive and empowering, solution-focused way, which I love, because this problem can seem overwhelming and the weight of it can just bum people out and make them think, good gosh, forget it. And then you have to continuously remind people that from every level of the system, from community groups that are grassroots based, advocacy groups, legal groups, different levels of providers and academics and researchers, there's a lot of collective pushback on this now. And I wouldn't suggest you do use the language overtly for obstetric violence in your scripts for advocacy, but your scripts for advocacy is a series of examples of obstetric violence and helping people navigate, avoid, and be victorious when they are confronted with those things.
You're making me blush. You guys, I promise I did not tell her to say these things. I just care so deeply that people are getting consensual care. It does actually kill me to see it. It really impacts me to see women be taken advantage in a healthcare system that not only are we told is gonna keep us safe, but in some cases actually does the exact opposite. And in many cases, they're aware that they're doing it. And for me, I just think that's such a great injustice that, yeah, I want people to realize what is obstetrical violence. And I think a lot of people in their brain, they're thinking of doctors yelling and throwing things, and you're stupid and saying just obvious things. Their behavior is very obviously violent. And there are, I dare I say, most times it's not violent at all in terms of what you actually hear. A lot of times this is covert violence, and women don't even recognize what they're being faced with.
So my version of fun, this may actually be fun to ask in this setting. So just a little background for everybody. Not only do Brie and I have shared interests in midwifery workforce issues as a solution specifically to obstetric violence, but also as a solution to a lot of the experience-based and clinical outcomes and access problems in the United States system. But Brie was also one of my committee members on my PhD committee. So you having said that, the torment of finishing a PhD, Brie, do you at all want to say anything about the differences between what we call the analogy of the iceberg, the tip we see at the top, the visible, any reasonable person would recognize that behavior or action as obstetric violence, and the massive piece underneath that is what supports the entire structure and organization of how it happens. And folks like Brie, who work on scientific measurement tools, that is what we do not have in the United States yet for obstetric violence. We do not have a validated measurement tool. Do you want to say anything about that?
I do. First, I love the analogy of the iceberg. The CDC has used that analogy for years with maternal mortality and maternal morbidity. And this sounds tangential, but it's actually very related, I think, is the kind of framework that CDC has used in their focus on maternal mortality is that mortality is at the tip of the iceberg, and that underneath that is severe morbidity, and then there is all of these other less severe morbidities, and that is inclusive of these pieces, these actions of obstetric violence. And so I think when people conceptualize maternal health, there's been across different areas, including these national public health initiatives, and then through to your work, Lorraine, this envisioning this iceberg is a really nice way to think about what we see. What is blatantly obvious is just a small piece of all of the harms that are being perpetuated literally every minute of every day in our healthcare, in our maternal healthcare system. I hesitate to call it a system because it's not really a system.
The pieces of our system, the
Yeah.
fragmented pieces that we struggle with. And I did reach across my desk there and pulled up a paper because I'm in my home office and I'm surrounded by stacks of publications from both within the United States and around the world. And one of the commentary pieces from Christine Morton and Penny Simkin is titled, "Can Respectful Maternity Care Save and Improve Lives?" And like Brie was saying, they are absolutely connected. People can recognize the impact of the loss and the gravity of a maternal death or a severe neonatal injury or death. But we're really talking about operationalizing respectful maternity care at a level now where both with the individual at the point of care, where as human beings, we interact and provide care and receive care from one another in those relationships, and the organization of how we provide that care in different facilities, which can vary greatly, not only around the world, but within a heavily populated area like New York City, you can have a hospital within a lot of that literature is specific to Black women's maternal mortality specifically. You can have a maternal mortality rate of 4 times greater than white people in one hospital. Within walking distance, go to another hospital where that rate is 12 times greater. That is how strong the variation is within the organization of where different individual providers have relationships where we do have disproportionate amount of power, and we are supposed to be in a loyal and trusting relationship with the people who are in our care.
Gosh, I just feel overcome with like sadness of is this even fixable? Can we even fix this? It goes so deep. Um, what would account for the difference in those outcomes? In one hospital having a 4% maternal mortality rate and one hospital having 12%. And we're talking about like Black and brown women specifically.
Yeah, that is again one of the areas in life and research. Obstetric racism as a standalone problem that Dr. Davis did a lot of conceptual work, really defining obstetric racism is a standalone problem in the United States, specifically with our unique history of colonization, racism, Black people specifically, and other marginalized groups. It both intersects with obstetric violence, and there are teams of researchers, community workers, reproductive justice and birth equity and health equity workers who dedicate their entire careers and work life specifically to that problem. I almost feel like it would be disrespectful and possibly misrepresent some of their work to not have a full handle on the details of very important work. That's Dr. Scott, Dr. Monica McLemore, Dr. Davis, a very long list.
How would people find this out about their hospitals? How do you go about finding these rates? Because if you're a Black woman, you want to know this. You deserve to know what hospitals you're safe at and what hospitals you're not.
It's a universal question and a layered question. All of this has layers and intersectional pieces to it. Universally, the problem is that hospitals in the United States are not obligated. There is no public transparency. So for example, there's a publicly accessible website called the Leapfrog Group. Hospitals may report their key quality statistics to Leapfrog, or they may not. For example, where I am in the Southwest, in the Las Vegas area now, having previously been a New York City, New Jersey midwife and birth worker, our worst offender for our hospital with the highest primary cesarean rate was reporting for years a 49% to 52% primary cesarean rate. I was having a conversation with a family who was consulting with me about, like you said, choosing a facility, because choosing a facility can be a related and sometimes a different question than choosing a provider. But to wrap it all up, I had referred them to look at that hospital simply stopped reporting and publishing its stats. So now you don't see anything for it.
In California, the California Perinatal Care Quality Collaborative initiative led to all hospitals having to report their cesarean rates. And they saw a marked decrease in cesarean rates statewide.
When they had to report them?
Well,
When they knew the public was looking?
It was there was part of a larger quality improvement initiative, and that is part of it, is that they're transparent in California about their cesarean rates. The Joint Commission now requires reporting cesarean rates. However, you have to only report it if it's above a specific rate that's predetermined. So you don't see the variation, but that you do have to report it if it's over a certain rate. So there is increased transparency specifically around that metric, which is an important metric. And it's a metric that is sensitive that tells us a lot about the type of care being delivered in those institutions. And it's not the end all be all. And yes, it's important we start to report cesarean rates, but we also need to think about what other metrics do we want to have reported? What is the information that is going to really allow, as you alluded to, birthing individuals to make that choice based on and also partially what's based on what's important to them?
Yeah, so what are some of those questions? What should we be asking?
That gets into, I think, Brie trying to make the distinction that on its face, if you're talking about clinical outcomes, like reducing episiotomy rates, classic Hawthorne effect, when people are watching, the majority of people will behave better, like little children. When there is any accountability or people watching. One unit leader I know in a hospital in the region where I am now, they used a simple whiteboard for public reporting. They took a lot of the key clinical outcomes for primary cesarean rates, trial of labor after cesarean, successful VBACs, episiotomies, scheduled inductions for non-medical reasons. Every one of those numbers improved for everybody collectively on the unit, except for one person who was known to be the worst offender. And not to get lost in that point, it's really more of the distinction, because we're all over the place and we're still on question one. What is obstetric violence? Obstetric violence is associated with clinical procedures. It is not defined by clinical procedures. Women can have medically complex needs and require cesareans to have good care. Obstetric violence is associated to the misuse of procedures, the hyper-medicalized overuse of them, the abuse of power in lack of informed consent, coercion, or force. It is not defined by the procedures itself. That can be one of the sticking points that make particularly physicians, who in the organization of US Care are the only ones who perform cesareans, midwives, not even under emergency circumstance will a midwife in the United States ever be performing a cesarean. That makes them really gun shy of the concept. It's not a place where you want to get stuck, because centering the features that are human, that have to do with the humanization of care. Women can have really rough goes through their pregnancy, their labor, their birth. They can do that with no trauma and without feeling that they've experienced obstetric violence when they receive dignified care, humanized care, respectful care. They have opportunities to debrief and not be gaslit and have their experience minimized and erased or reconstructed by somebody who's trying to turn it into something else. That is the tricky part about understanding obstetric violence, and more importantly, moving on to eliminating and correcting it.
I think this brings us to the topic of how we measure obstetric violence. And obstetric violence, respectful maternity care, that we have these sort of blunt instruments for patient satisfaction surveys. but they and they are valuable. And when you going back to your question about how should people be able to choose their hospital, they should know about the experience of people who've birthed there before, not just how their mode of delivery, but what was their experience like. There is an excellent app called Earth.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a great place and I think that they're really setting the tone for how we should be holding hospitals accountable in a way that people who've birthed there can really tell you about we call them the experiential outcomes. So that's the outcome, that's not the clinical outcome, but it's about their experience. And so I think Lorraine's worked on, are we able to create some of these validated measurement tools that then we can have people answering that then can create those? Is it 3.5 stars? Is it we choose everything these days based on how many stars. Everything we buy on Amazon or restaurants we go to, I'm going to go to the one that's got 4.8 instead of 4.6. And so, unfortunately, as much as we don't want to quantify the birthing experience, that is how our society makes choices. That's how our society is able to ascertain and intake information. And importantly, it's how hospital administrators, it's what they respond to are those numbers. And so I think I know it's a priority to get some of these instruments tested, well validated, and then really integrated into the patient satisfaction sphere that hospitals now are required to do. But that's something that are more specific to the birthing experience and not as simple as were you satisfied with your care, but getting more in there.
Brie and I are on more than one study team together for things that are in progress. One of the things that we are really getting close to, this is a complicated subject and people have strong opinions about it. We've really been through the ringer on the peer review process. That is a very important part of publishing rigorous empirical scientific research, but here we go. I'm going to talk a little bit, maybe just to try to wrap up. And this one is probably the first time for saying, what is obstetric violence? What does it look like? To try to wrap up that question for folks who may want to plug their ears or tune out for a moment. When you really do talk about what Brie was saying, the experience of obstetric violence, and that is the lived experience of people that can be graphic. Like you said, sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's obvious. The work that we're getting very close to having published answers the main objective is the research question is, what is the meaning of obstetric violence in the US maternity care system? And we used a pre-existing sample from a social media campaign, from the Break the Silence campaign that Kristen Pascucci and the group that she was working with from back when they did that together. They created this social media campaign that is still visible. The page is visible on Facebook. We used all that data with a lot of background and context provided by Kristen. And through that thematic analysis, initially you arrive through the analytic procedure with categories. Those categories are expanded to the essence of meaning in themes. And the 10 descriptive categories for the experiences, again, the data is the self-published, self-described experiences of birthing people and those who care for them who published signboard messages in this social media campaign. And those categories were access to care as a healthcare systems issue, birth rape, breach of trust by a healthcare provider, coerced or forced procedures, using the dead baby card or a fetocentric approach to care, depersonalized or dehumanized encounters, medical gaslighting, impaired newborn bonding, lack of informed consent, and those whose categorical descriptions in their signs actually equaled victory in avoiding obstetric violence. And when you finish up that analytic process and the group is coming to consensus on the thematic meanings of what's present there, Those thematic meanings were pregnancy and birth as a battle with healthcare providers and the healthcare system, sacrifice of the maternal body normalized and assumed as a gender stereotype, disrupted rites of passage from childbirth, and abuse of fiduciary power by healthcare providers. This is going to provide people who are interested in what the meaning, the experiential meaning of obstetric violence looks like.
It is so insane how many of those things that you said, and I was able to picture. I mean, I just got so many flashbacks. My eyes watered at one point because I can just see the people that I've served that encountered these things. I want to dive into a couple of the things that you said. You mentioned avoiding birth trauma. For people who are preparing for birth, what are some tips that they can do to help themselves avoid birth trauma? Quick and dirty. I know, I see your face. You're like, that's a whole episode. Quick and dirty off the top of your head when you're thinking about, for me, it's see a midwife, have open communication, know what your options are.
There's a lot of great work on this. Becca Wheeler out of California is really working to apply the science of trauma that we have. And there's a really rich area of trauma science about how we physiologically respond to experiences and why some experiences, why the exact same experience can be experienced as a trauma for one person and not for another, or can turn into a long-term trauma disorder as opposed to having had a negative experience. So I think there's a lot to unpack there around how we think about, there's the pieces of how we need to change birth. And there's also ways that we need to think more globally in society about trauma. And I really think she would be a great person, whether you want to include her here. But I also always refer people, because I think understanding what it is can help prevent it. There are definitely things that need to happen in the system level. But I think both for providers and people, like, because you were asking about, birthing individuals, really understanding it and understanding when you have an experience that is traumatic, how to process that in a way that it doesn't seep into your bones.
Yeah, you're able to move through it.
And the part I would say is access to midwifery care is an issue by itself in the United States. We have again, a unique and long history to correct, to rebuild a strong and diverse midwifery workforce. So a big piece of that is for people who have access to midwifery care, and that's important to them. You have to hold space for the wide diversity of what people want and what makes them feel cared for and respected. That's the key feature of trauma-informed care and person-centered, respectful maternity care. What does a midwife do with a client who, for whatever reason, we won't even get lost in the weeds there, but a client who absolutely knows she wants a planned primary cesarean for absolutely no medical indication? If I truly believe in and respect patient-centered care, it's my duty as a clinician to make sure that the person is informed about that. But it's absolute, I'm guilty of the same problem if I superimpose my belief system on that person and block her from access to that. There are things that we struggle with when we are really trying to walk the walk of the talk we talk. It's a complicated landscape out there. But for women who want and have access to midwives, there's another tricky little trapdoor there. You need to, as much as possible, know that you have connected with and begun a relationship with a midwife who works in a setting where she is empowered to behave and provide true midwifery care. If you plug a midwife into a standard, limited, hyper-medicalized biomedical model of care and only allow her to function in that way, you've done nothing to improve the likelihood, like you said, when you were asking for tips. Midwives aren't magic when we can't act like midwives.
I think that speaks to so many people who sought out midwifery care as a way, as a protective factor to prevent birth trauma, to give themselves a chance at a good birth. And they were very caught off guard by the care that they received by the midwife in the hospital system.
An important point is also that, interestingly, the experience of people not receiving what we perceive as midwifery care, what we define as midwifery care from a midwife, not only adversely affects the person, the birthing individual receiving the care, it also adversely affects midwives. And we have an extremely high burnout rate. We have a quarter of certified nurse midwives and certified midwives not working within the discipline of midwifery. And one of the reasons that midwives leave midwifery practice or decide not to attend births despite having the licensure to do is that they themselves don't want to provide care that is not consistent with the midwifery model of care. And that they're in settings where they're not able to practice consistently with their values, and it's harming the midwife as well as it's harming the birthing individual. And in light of the fact that we have a shortage of maternity care providers, all maternity care providers throughout the United States, we really need to think about the environment that we're putting midwives and all healthcare providers into, that a system that perpetuates obstetric violence, that is harming not only the patients, not only the birthing individuals, but also harming the workforce and traumatizing the workforce as well. And so really thinking about this as a systematic problem, the policies, the procedures, the way we bill for births, the turn and churn mentality of healthcare, that we have CEOs, administrators financially reaping the benefits of birth. That's where the problem really lies. Yes, there are a few bad eggs amongst providers, but we have a system that perpetuates violence.
Okay, I want to dig into that because a lot of times I talk about OBs, but I know I'm talking about a larger system, but the OBs are the ones that we're interacting with. So if our midwives are hurting and our providers, our healthcare providers are hurting and our patients are hurting, who is benefiting from this? Who does obstetric violence serve if there's so many people in our immediate circle that are being harmed?
I think there's an assumption there that violence of any form serves somebody. And I think that we need to be careful with that idea, because whether we're talking about obstetric violence, interpersonal violence in the home, violence on the street, I think going at it with the assumption that it benefits somebody is, I think there's some logical fallacy in that. So I think that the question, I think, is it is the consequence of an industrialized maternity care system. I don't know that there's anybody directly that it serves. It's more the product, if that makes sense.
If we sidestep from obstetric violence for a moment, I think that's the important distinction that Brie just helped make that describes how we've arrived at our current predicament. We're talking about a system that has evolved for so many different reasons in an industrialized country that is the only high-income nation in the world that has consistently dug in on making the choice to have a for-profit healthcare system. There are programmatic and organizational decisions that are made every day at every level in every piece of the system, including our insurance, everything, for how access to care, payment for care, and how we receive care is organized in a system that is designed to be a for-profit healthcare system. And it hurts the people who require care. And Brie had said, it is not your crusty, insensitive people, to use an old-fashioned phrase, who have the worst bedside manner. They're not the ones suffering from bystander trauma, secondary post-traumatic stress, moral distress. You have an entire nursing workforce, midwifery workforce, unlicensed assistive personnel, our certified nurses assistants, our technicians, and our physicians. It is most often our best, brightest, and most caring people who feel the emotional pain of burnout and leave first, or fall into despair from it and then are no longer the best version of themselves.
Oh my gosh. I resonate so deeply with that. I have watched doula friends go through that. I have seen nurse friends leave the bedside. I have the privilege of having a large social media, and with that comes like really cool connections. And there's so many people that will share their stories with me of being abused by the system. And I think it's a place where I don't know that I necessarily stand alone, but it's a topic that I talk about often that I don't see a lot of my colleagues talking about is that our healthcare systems are being abused as well. Okay, so my last question for you guys is how do we fix this? You're working on tools. So ideally, what? We get tools into the hospital, we start giving out ratings, and then is the answer midwifery care? Is the answer integrating our system in a larger idea? Dare I ask, like, your feelings on home birth and say, should we divest some of the people into home birth and have people that are just appropriate for hospital birth there? What's the goal to fix this?
I'll start with where you and I met for the first time. So, like I said, of the many levels, peoples, professions, and places that so many people are working on solutions to this and solutions that do work. But you're talking about ultimately building enough momentum from enough different people and different positions that you achieve a full paradigm shift. The A1, the Association for Women's Health, Obstetric and Neonatal Nurses, the A1 Science Team in 2022 published their theoretical framework and evidence-based practice recommendations for respectful maternity care. The biggest universal takeaway for those recommendations is that you facilitate a culture of respect for all patients by all providers at all times in all settings. That's the universal solution. Education is one of the biggest pieces of that. There should not be any health sciences students from their starting point in their education who are not introduced to concepts and practices for achieving specifically respectful maternity care and for being introduced to the very difficult problems of obstetric violence and obstetric racism if they are moving towards working in any kind of female reproductive health or perinatal care field.
Brie, do you have anything to add to that? I feel like that was a mic drop moment.
I agree. And I think from a larger, we talked a lot, and I think I misspoke and referred to as industrialized, but really it's the for-profit. I also want to circle back to Lorraine's point about the for-profit system. And that is really the leverage point. I believe that we need to figure out how to penalize hospitals for perpetuating obstetric violence. There needs to be figure out a way that Medicaid is not reimbursing. If you get a certain score or below a certain score, or above a certain score, however we need to do it, they're not getting their money, because that is when change happens, unfortunately, in our for-profit system. That we really need to have a price tag on giving respectful maternity care. And then I think we'll start to see administrators provide the space necessary for healthcare providers, experts in this area, to say, what do you need to provide respectful maternity care? Oh, you need more time. You need an antenatal visit that doesn't last 7 minutes after a person's been waiting for 2 hours in a clinic setting. You need to spend actually half an hour with somebody at every antenatal visit, every postpartum visit, and those postpartum visits should go for a full year. and they should be through telehealth or in person or in the home of whomever. But let the people who know about this build a system that will then provide the respectful care. And that needs to happen with, I think, just not reimbursing. That when there is a dollar sign attached to it, that we will get the space we need to do what we know to be right. We know to be better care. Patients know what it is. Birthing individuals know what better care looks like and feels like. And the majority of providers know what respectful maternity care looks and feels. People don't come into this field because they don't like birthing individuals. It used to be that you made a lot of money in healthcare, not anymore. Even the providers at the top are not making tons of money anymore.
Okay, I want to know more about
can.
that. That's crazy to me. I know you have to go, Brie, but Lorraine, could you explain how you had talked about the finances beforehand and how that provider can get caught up in the conundrum of who are they loyal to? Are they loyal to their patients or are they loyal to the system? Talk to us about that.
There are so many emerging statistics and again, people who I wish I could pull this statistic accurately out of the air. It's another piece where physicians in particular are almost always corporate employed now. They work for corporations. I remember, because I've been doing this for decades, I'm not so old, but I am old enough that I am firmly middle-aged, and I have seen a lot change just over that time. Some for the better, and many things that are just making it harder for the best of us to provide the best of care that we're capable of. That is a huge crisis in the quality and personal satisfaction for physicians. Everybody knows how to use. I'll let the public, I'll let your listeners fact check me. I remember when I got disturbed when it crossed 50%. Oh, greater than 50% of physicians now are employed by corporations and not in individual private or small group practice. I think it's 80% now.
Tell the listeners why that's a problem.
Because the beast is getting bigger. The corporatization and the dehumanization of not only what people have access to choose, like you said, how do people choose? When you actually shift to a business conversation and you call the person seeking maternity care the consumer, because in the United States, you absolutely are the consumer, whether you feel like that or not, you're the consumer. How do you find the person or the group who is going to provide you with the things that when you are a prepared pregnant individual and you come in with your early list of preferences, or you come in later in the pregnancy with your developing birth plan, and you want to feel confident, you want to have some joy in your pregnancy. You don't want to feel like it's a battle the whole time. I always tell people this should be a little bit fun. We should be having a little bit of fun together through this pregnancy and this birth. And what happens is there are corporate constraints. There are corporate directives that these physicians are beholden to for volume production, for hitting revenue targets, these are corporate mandates. Anesthesiologists move around classically through corporate groups. People get their surgeries that are considered not emergency essential surgeries. People get their elective surgeries canceled all the time now because there's no anesthesiologist. We have a pretty well hidden crisis of a lack of providers of all types. Certain types in particular, the crisis is more acute. Maternity care specifically, people who are interested to it or your listeners who may have experienced it, we have what are called maternity care deserts. Women who drive 2 to 4 hours or more, depending on where they live in the United States of America. Mm-hmm. We still have a lot of rural and frontier areas in the United States. And sometimes it's the remaining hospital has such a atrocious reputation, I will choose them to drive 2 to 4 hours away to, for example, access care where I can feel safe that for the possibility to have a VBAC, to access care where I can have a preferred provider. There are so many heads to this monster, and so much of it has to do that the United States has a for-profit healthcare system that is increasingly being taken over by corporate interests and mass corporate grabbings of all the different pieces that they may own the imaging center, they may own the lab, they may own, I got stuck in an employment situation where the same corporation that was the majority interest holder of the private community hospital owned the malpractice underwriting company, because at one point in my current state's history, there was a malpractice crisis, and most of the underwriters left and stopped supporting specifically OB midwifery policies.
Oh my
It is
God.
getting increasingly harder. We are shifting, like I said, but we're still parallel to the problem, parallel and intersectional to the problem of obstetric violence, that it is getting harder for providers to provide the care that they enter the profession with the goal to be doing. And that's at every level. I've worked with medical students. I do true interdisciplinary care throughout my history. I work with medical students. I work with nursing students. I work with both types of midwifery students, people who are on a certified nurse midwife pathway, and dedicated community birth workers who are on a CPM pathway. The reasons that people come to the healthcare professions, and specifically women's healthcare and OB and midwifery care, is a deep attraction to initially caring and wanting to help and do the best of what we can offer.
Yeah.
And those are all the types of big pieces that the public may not even be aware of sometimes. And they're like, why can't this work? I used to be, you might have already gathered, I'm quite a transparent, painfully honest person. I used to tell, I've worked in both. You asked about what does it look like, and you introduced community care. People who will just opt out of the hospital system, who will start a GoFundMe, who will have their baby shower party be about funding their home birth. They shouldn't have to do those things, but what again we have in the United States is a healthcare system that varies greatly by state. Number one, private midwife care might not be covered, and your insurance may have a complete exclusion for home birth care.
Really?
You may have, I work in birth centers, also birth center singular. The state of Nevada only has one. Serenity Birth Center is the only freestanding birth center in Southwest Nevada in Las Vegas. And we have people regularly who have insurance that tells them, we'll pay your provider, and this is the insurance determining this, we'll pay your provider for your care, but we won't pay the facility fee for your birth center birth. And I can tell you the facility fee is multiple times greater than what the fee schedule is for the provider. And then the person is, WTF, I guess you're telling me I can't have a birth center birth because I don't have an extra $7,000+ sitting around.
Okay, and what is the benefit there? Because they would rather you birth at the hospital because there's negotiated rates there? Is that the thing?
That is the collective stranglehold of all of the power and the money in the US healthcare system. Even since, if you just tried to put a pin in it and say that there was a significant shift in US women and birthing people saying, I'm not going to the hospital for childbirth, when things got totally out of hand during COVID, and incidents of obstetric violence and abuses of birthing people, neonates, non-medically supported separations of mothers and babies, women being isolated and birthing by themselves, things that there was no evidence base for, but these are the decisions that were made. That was a big push in the US. People were like, forget it. Myself and my other out-of-hospital midwifery colleagues, we couldn't keep up. We were working around the clock. We had never had such a time-specific explosion of people looking for, and finding the confidence, all of a sudden finding the confidence, I don't need a hospital to give birth. I don't need a hospital to give birth. Forget that. That's the last thing I want. We are still in a situation where there is a significant increase in numbers of women who are looking for out-of-hospital birth services, either at home or in birth centers. Still 98% of women give birth in a hospital here. And one of the other things that's related that's really interesting to think about, even for self-reflection and work satisfaction for midwives, Mimi Niles and one of her study groups, they did a study where they oversampled from women who had received midwifery care so that they would have a great enough number of people to have the statistical power to make these meaningful statements. Women experienced, I'm going to make sure I use the same language that she did, women experienced higher autonomy and significantly greater experiential outcomes, their experience of care overall with midwives in comparison to physicians. But then Niles and her team went one step further and found a similar pattern between women's and birthing people's reports of their experience of care, which was again significantly better with women who had midwife care, with midwives who attended them out of the hospital. Doesn't mean that those were better midwives or more caring midwives. What they had is the freedom to provide 100% midwifery care. And I don't know this just from research. I have worked in all settings. And for multiple reasons, most recently, it's coming up on a year. Prior to that, I had privileges at 4 hospitals, and I was attending, at that time, I was attending women for birth in hospitals only. Coming up on 1 year in September, I withdrew from all my hospital privileges, and I am now dedicated to attending births at Serenity Birth Center only, and to our families and women who prefer to birth at home.
Why did you decide to divest from the system?
I am a different version of myself in real life practice. My belief system, I'm pretty sure people can have a crystal clear picture of my belief system from this chat. My belief system never changed. What I represent and what I stand for has never changed. That's been the same since I worked as a registered nurse X number of years ago. What did change is the policy, organizational, and widely varying hospital restrictions of how much of a midwife and how much midwifery care I could provide. Because I also came from a situation where I worked at 4 different hospitals. There's a different set of rules and binding delineation of privileges. You can attend a woman who's 36 weeks here, or 36 and 0. You can attend a woman who's 34 and 0 here. You can attend a woman who has this variation, still working fully with a plan of care towards vaginal birth, but all of a sudden the midwife gets kicked out of the picture. There is a different playbook in every hospital and hospital systems for when a midwife may be forced to throw in the towel and concede to the person that she has this relationship with, I'm no longer in charge of this here. I will still stand by you and do everything I can, but the honest answer is I'm not in charge of this anymore.
That right there is ultimately why I don't go back to midwifery school, is because having my hands tied when I know that this person is making the decision 100% informed, they feel comfortable with the risk, they have had so many conversations about it, they're choosing it out of their own free will and autonomy. They're making this decision. They feel like they have qualified support, and then the state tells you midwife is not allowed to attend a birth after 42 weeks, or the hospital tells you because the midwife can't attend this. I have looked into multiple avenues of becoming a midwife, and it is ultimately that stops me, because the thought of that is so gut-wrenching, to build this relationship with someone and to know that because we can't respect patient autonomy, everyone pays the price. So, what I'm hearing is patient autonomy actually benefits everybody. Your clinicians will feel confident. Your clinicians will feel like they have a relationship with their patients. The people who I think aren't going to benefit or don't think that they can benefit are the hospitals and the investors and your insurance companies. So, my next question is, ideally, if we got to redo all the payer systems, what would you do? How would you have us paying out? What would that fiduciary responsibility look like between insurance and hospitals and then what your providers make? I assume right off the bat we should be, I guess, reimbursing vaginal deliveries at a much higher rate. A piece of me comes back. I actually didn't know before this episode that JACO has a number that hospitals are quote unquote allowed to have. And then did Brie say that they get penalized for C-sections that are above that rate?
That was, I don't want to speak on her behalf, but what I can say for sure is she was talking about California specifically.
Oh,
So it's, again, the very bizarre and inflamed and strategically intentional entanglement of healthcare with politics in the United
mm,
States makes us so misinformed and triggered and angry about usually the wrong things. A dialogue has very intentionally been set up that will make people very strongly argue um, against their own better interests, but believe that it represents something that is better or right. And it's very twisted. Again, it's another very twisted entanglement of there is so much money at stake. That is the reason politics are so grossly entangled with healthcare in the United States. The amount of money that is at stake, the number of lobbyists that are employed, drug reps, people who never have patient contact, never even went to, have no education in healthcare or the delivery of care. These are business people. These are business people. One quick thing that came to mind is no, I would not incentivize reimbursement ever. There should be equal reimbursement for a cesarean birth or a vaginal birth. You don't want clinicians making a decision in either direction that is influenced by finances. Women who need or want a cesarean should have that birth experience without the, again, current mixed bag of feelings of, did I really need that? That was done against my will. I feel like I was tricked. Or in the very rare chances, I wanted that. I told them I didn't want to push. I wanted a cesarean. And you don't want people making care decisions based on money at all. No, I believe the reimbursement for a cesarean, an uncomplicated surgical birth for cesarean, and an uncomplicated vaginal birth should be equal. They should be equal. And then the other things are that, again, the general public, your head would explode if you thought about all the different things that those of us who work on the policy end of this and try to correct, try to right the ship. Very recently, a working group that I'm part of in Nevada, we have states where midwives and nurse practitioners don't get reimbursed at 100% for the equivalent service, where we sometimes have greater value and patient satisfaction. For a long time, literally until January 1, Nevada was a 75% payer state. Midwives who believed very strongly in reproductive justice, believed very strongly in birth equity, and were intentionally trying to extend themselves to women who are underserved and who rely on Medicaid. We had to make horrible decisions about capping. We'd lose money. Every time we welcomed a Medicaid family into our practice, we would lose money. And, that's the reason that you see birth equity groups that have not-for-profits. They keep trying to work outside the system. The Bigger Table Fund, the birth equity, I think I'm not going to remember their name right now, but the Bigger Table Fund does it very intentionally. And there are many other groups. They're trying to make up for all the horrific and illogical gaps in the system, the payer system, that makes it so that the people who may need that type of care as an option most to have better outcomes and not be re-traumatized from other disadvantaged structural inequities that have been part of their lives, to not be re-traumatized and multiply traumatized by those things. They're the ones who sometimes are looking most for other options. And then you bump into these barriers. The perfect example I just used, we still have states. The ACNM publishes state charts that show you which states are not equal pay states for midwives and nurse practitioners. Of course, all the things that I'm most familiar with are perinatal and women's health, but it's an issue across all areas of health equity and accessible access. And that would be one of the other things. So it's a very long answer to only make the second point in your question about what are the types of stuff we need to fix. That is the second point. We need pay parity for midwives. And probably next, that is the most obvious, is that we have to require both Medicaid and commercial insurance to integrate midwifery into normalized choices in pregnancy and childbirth and newborn care in the United States. There are so many insurances that have absolute exclusions for home birth. People who pay their premiums, people who believe up to that point of pregnancy, they thought they were well insured. And then they find out, oh, I want to have a home birth, and my insurance has an absolute exclusion for that. We have dedicated employees who do nothing but work with insurance. That's another layer of where money goes, even in very small midwife practices. Once you make the agreement that you want to make yourself available to women, not just as a cash boutique practice, which I have worked in that version of it also, but I cannot reconcile myself with the ethics of it. I understand why people choose it. But then again, you're basically saying to people, you can either pay, and again, it's thousands of dollars, depending on what state and the qualifications of the person. You're pretty much talking about from $3,000 to $5,000. Oh, you can pay $3,000 to $5,000 out of pocket? Good for you. Then you can enjoy the benefits of this type of care. Oh, you can't? Then I guess this isn't an option for you. Of course, here I am intentionally using the PhD portion of what I do, meeting with senators, meeting with state representatives, meeting with Medicaid directors, a very complicated system itself, having a staff within our group practice where there are people in administration who do nothing but negotiate with insurance all day about getting people who want birth center or home births to be covered by the insurance that they pay for, their commercial private insurance. Those three things. It's long answers to all of it, but those three things: pay parity, normalizing midwifery care as an equivalent option, and again, even calling it an equivalent clinical option, recognizing that it has proven benefits for the birthing person, the baby, and the family unit.
Do you think we can get there? Do you think it's possible?
I'm become increasingly interested in all. So let me say yes. I don't want to get lost again in the weeds again before I absolutely answer the question. Sometimes I've even started shifting and thinking that as both an academic and a community advocacy and activist expert on this issue, I need to start leading with the yes. I need to start leading with the solutions instead of the conversation typically starting with the problem. We can fix this. There are a lot of discussions now about it, much like Brie said, being a consumer-led movement. That doesn't mean it's right, but you can't win a fight against a system where your strategy for winning that fight doesn't match the system you're fighting against. These consumer-led solutions where women and families demand changes in access and payer provider and really make noise when they do not receive those things. Or again, like when you were talking to attorney Hayes Klein, and there are others. I'm newly talking with a woman here who is an attorney in the state of Nevada. When she gets up and running, I think she goes by the handle @YourLegalDoula or Your Legal Doula right now. But she will be, to my knowledge, the first attorney in the state of Nevada who's going to dedicate herself to birth rights, obstetric violence, and experiential and clinical harms to the pregnant, birthing, and family unit. And she's also talking about things like breastfeeding accommodations, abuses that happen to pregnant people throughout their pregnancy or after, with abuses from their employer that may or may not be legal sometimes. It's a yes, it's a yes. There are people, again, from every piece of the circle, round and round, who are moving more strongly, who are connecting more to each other so that people don't feel like they're reinventing the wheel every time. I tell people all the time, I sit in a home office surrounded by stacks and files of this information, not only in the United States, but around the world, globally. Please don't reinvent the wheel. If you are just beginning, you have no budget, you do have a budget. None of us can keep working for free all the time, but you shouldn't leave person hanging. If we're in this shared struggle together, we need to find each other. We need to recognize which people from which pieces of the puzzle are already doing the work so that we're not constantly starting over or feeling isolated or feeling like, oh gosh, this happened to me. I feel disempowered. I feel overwhelmed. I feel ashamed. I feel ambivalent. All of those emotions that you know from your own work that can go along with this that are very heavy. These are universal things. I don't have the most common name. If you just type in a search anywhere that is Lorraine M. Garcia and obstetric violence, most people don't want to spend their time reading research, but I design studies intentionally that center the experience of the birthing person and solutions. And all of those other pieces like Brie, Thumm, Dr. Brie Thumm, Brie, and I know all this is in bios. She specifically does midwifery workforce issues, including midwifery practice climate scales that measure and associate how much midwives experience actual authenticity in practicing in a midwifery model of care, how much we do or do not experience that, and the associated departure from the profession or the associated burnout and emotions from suffering from that. It's all related, and not one single piece of it is simple.
Yeah. It's really hard to hear that the system beats midwives up so much that they want to leave the system in a system that actually desperately needs more midwives. And we know that midwives are the obvious and logical answer to so many of our problems. I do want to ask one controversial question, though. Do hospitals get paid more for C-sections than they do vaginal deliveries?
It's, to me, that's not even controversial. It's an important question. The mess of it all is that there's not a universal answer. Some places, yes, some places, no. By some insurance payers, yes. By some insurance payers, no. If you look at national data, the national data will definitely show us that overall cesarean births cost much more than vaginal births. But there's not a single answer to that either. And that shouldn't even feel like a controversial question. Once
Yeah.
again, I would never want to incentivize clinicians making the seriousness and the gravity of the decisions we make in a complicated labor and birth. Birth is all fun and joy when it's medically uncomplicated. And even if it's emergent, when you have true emergent medical complications in labor, birth, or the neonatal management immediately after, I tell people all the time, make no mistake about it. Do not draw a line in the sand ever where you universally view physicians as the enemy. They are
Totally.
not. They
Yeah.
are as essential part of the team as anybody else.
Mm.
You had asked questions about also what people could look for when they are trying to. It's not what's most common in the United States, but if you have access to a hospital where midwives are integrated into, not just have private practice privileges there. One of my hospitals in New Jersey where I worked at, I was hospital employed. I was a full service. We had a 24/7 midwifery service in-house. That's when you see the most ideal examples, with bumps in the road always. It is work. There is no work that is as connected to humanity as being medically responsible, clinically responsible for the well-being and the welfare of a pregnant woman, her child, and the ripple effect to that entire family.
Yeah.
But if you want to see defying the odds for taking care of populations on paper that look like they have every risk factor that there is, then you go to a hospital that fully integrates midwives into their staff, empowers those midwives to offer what we can offer for midwifery models of care. And you can watch they call it they used to call it the clinic paradox. Sometimes they call it the midwifery paradox. Please, okay, on paper, you want to give me somebody with a large body size who's a chronic hypertensive, who has issues. I'm not talking about being insulin dependent, but has issues managing blood sugar and is a type 1 GDMA, gestational diabetic. You give that person to a midwife team and you watch that person thrive. And so where it does exist, fully integrated, and there's again an enormous amount. I think it's Nicole Carlson and Denise Smith and many others, because those are big teams once they do that kinds of research, that they look at outcomes at hospitals with samples of hundreds of thousands, multiple hundreds of thousands of birthing people and outcomes, and how much better the clinical outcomes are in hospital systems where midwives are integrated into full intraprofessional care.
Yeah. It makes
So
so
when you
much
ask
sense to
about
me.
solutions, there's a long list of them. There's a long list of them. People
Yeah.
need to demand them. And you're starting to get different players it's by grains of sand and slowly and painfully, but you're starting to get different players in more powerful positions that historically there haven't been in the United States. Black PhD researchers, Black women leading, designing studies on reproductive or health inequities. And you get a different research question, you get a different perspective or framework for that research, you're going to get more meaningful and useful answers to solve the problem. And it's not just academia, it's again, by grains of sands, small painful shifts, but when you see different people at places of power, the decisions that are made will often look very different than decisions that have been made in the past.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. This has been such an enriching conversation. I really appreciate you and Brie being here. This really has filled my soul. I know it was a heavier topic and not something that's necessarily super fun. It's intricate and it is detailed and it's layered, and there are some not so fun aspects to this conversation, but this is what gets me up every morning. These are the questions that also keep me up at night. These are the things that really they energize me, they push me forward. These are the questions that I want to answer. I agree with you on so many things that you said. I have for a long time said that the reason that I chose to educate women and their partners for birth is because I actually saw it as a consumer led effort. I believe that physicians and nurses play a big role into it too, because they're going to be they're crucial to this pivot that we need to make. But I think that consumers actually have the most power here in my mind. And I love to hear you say that, being that this is somewhat of a consumer led project. I also wholeheartedly agree. I say it all the time, but physicians definitely have a role. I just want to see us integrate midwifery care in the places where it's more appropriate than obstetric care, and for just everyone to have a defined role. We can have low risk people seeing midwifery care, and then when they need someone specialized like an OBGYN, we have plenty of OBGYNs that we can hand them off to, and we have hospitals that can care for them. But most people are birthing at home or in birth centers, and that I think that for me represents autonomy. It does on a bigger level represent a more integrated system, but for me it truly is living out the epitome of giving women the choice. You can have a home birth with a midwife, you can have a birth center with a midwife, you can have an OBGYN, you can have a hospital birth, you can have a chosen C-section if that's what you want. And for me, I think that's the ultimate goal. Lorraine, Thank you so much for being here, and Brie as well, even though she had to run. Please pass along my thank yous and my gratitude. And you guys have given me so many more people to reach out to have on the podcast to bring this information to our listeners. But if someone wanted to connect with you or share something with you, or they were interested in the work you were doing, where can they connect with you? And then you can connect them with Brie.
Correct. Yes. And I did make an intentional choice. I made a small joke about being firmly middle-aged. I have only recently created a social media and public presence, and now I have made myself very easy to find. For those people who use Instagram, you can find me at Making Birth Better Together. My professional website, the URL is makingbirthbettertogether.com.
I'd also like to invite all your listeners and followers to visit our online store with a special discount code for Birth Lounge 15 to use at makingbirthbetterstore.com.
Where we design products that contribute to the advocacy, policy, and education work we do to promote midwifery, access to midwives, doula care, social justice in nursing, reproductive justice issues, birth equity. That message needs to be walking around. There's a lot of people who are doing it. There's a lot of people who believe in it. That message needs to be walking around out there.
I love that. Oh my gosh. All good places. Truly, thank you to you and Brie for being here today. I really appreciate it. And listeners, I'll see you in the next episode. Be sure to follow Lorraine on Instagram, and you can follow me at Tranquility by HeHe or at the.birth.lounge. Until next time, head to your app store and download the Birth Lounge app for evidence-based childbirth education and data-driven postpartum support delivered straight to your phone. Bye. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I truly do value this community, and I love hanging out with you. You deserve to have a birth that you love with a provider that values your autonomy and respects informed consent. It's an honor to be your go-to gal when it comes to preparing for your baby. If you found today's episode helpful, share it with a friend. Share it with someone who could use evidence-based information to help them have an informed and confident birth. I'd love to hear what you have to say and read your sweet words. By leaving us a review, you are helping other expectant mamas and their families find the podcast so that we can reduce birth trauma and improve maternity care in the U.S. one birth at a time. If you're interested in joining the Birth Lounge, go to thebirthlounge.com. If you want to connect with me on socials, you can find me at Tranquility by HeHe on all platforms. Until next time, stay educated, stay supported, stay confident. Bye.